Welcome to another episode of the Trees and Lines podcast. Today, Tej and I will be speaking with Dr. Carolyn Grace Mahan, a professor at Penn State University and a leading researcher in the study of the effects of management on plant communities and wildlife occupying our utility rights-of-ways. Dr. Mahan leads the Gamelands 33 research project, which has guided our industry for 65 years. Have a listen. Hope you enjoy. Well, welcome, Carolyn. I really appreciate your joining us for the podcast. Exciting year, I believe, in some of the things you do, and anxious to talk to you about that. Why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and about the research there at Gamelands 33?
Well, it's nice to be here, Phil. My name is Carolyn Mahan. I'm a professor at Penn State. I'm a professor of biology and environmental studies, and I research a variety of ecological issues, include anything from squirrels to these power line rights-of-way work that I have been working with very closely since 2014. The project, though, as you know, Phil, precludes me, and it started in the 1950s. And I'm just one of the latest in a long line of researchers that have worked at State Gamelands 33 here in central Pennsylvania. And what we're trying to understand is how can industry manage habitat under rights-of-ways to increase biodiversity and to allow wildlife to persist in those types of landscapes. I'm not really clear, to be quite honest, about the very early sources of funding, but I do know this. I know that the electric transmission industry, the partners who help manage the actual habitat, they have provided funding for the research over the past 65 years. In addition, there have been matching funds provided by the universities in which the researchers are located. And for example, we always have students working on these projects. But as far as securing the funding, I think things have changed in the industry where there is now this growing interest in these community or these societal environmental goals that these industries, the power industry, the habitat management industry, like an Asplunk who manages trees, they are interested in showing that they are beholden to the public and how they do habitat management. So I think that is why the interest has moved away from just hunters, who are becoming a smaller and smaller part of our population, to this overall idea of biodiversity and how habitat is provided for biodiversity, which is the diversity of all living things, from plants to insects to mammals to birds. And that actually has a more general interest to the public. At least I think it does. And so I would say there has been a very good cooperation and interest from the funders and moving beyond the game species focus.
And if I recall, this is by far the longest ongoing research project. You hit 60 years, or you're about to?
65 years. So we're just passing 65 years. And the research project started when a power line was going through state gamelands, which are publicly owned lands here in Pennsylvania. And this power line was getting constructed in the 1950s. And hunters who used the gamelands were concerned about the effects this power line and maintaining the habitat under the power line would affect hunting populations. So hunters were concerned that perhaps herbicides needed to control vegetation growth would hurt populations of game animals. So when the project originally started back in the 50s again, the focus was on game species like deer and eastern cottontails and wild turkey. And we've since expanded that research looking at non-game species, including pollinators and most recently ground beetles.
So I know 60 years is a lot of results.
Yes, there's a lot of data with this particular project, yes.
So for you personally, what are the big takeaways?
The big takeaways from me is that when you manage habitat in these human landscapes, there's two objectives. The first objective in this case is, as you often say, Phil, your industry says, is for safety. So there are regulators who make sure that the area underneath rights of way are cleared of trees, because I think your listeners understand that as trees grow up into rights of ways, they can interfere with the transmission of electricity and harm the transmission lines. So you need to ask the question, what is happening with the habitat in terms of the power transmission, but then also how is the habitat managed? Is there a way that we can manage the habitat that it also can improve the landscape for wildlife? And my big takeaway is yes, we can manage that landscape for wildlife, particular species of wildlife, particular groups of wildlife, and we can do it successfully. It requires professionalism, it requires dedication, and it requires knowledge of the landscape to do it properly, but it can be done.
So what's the management strategies you've looked at? You've looked at herbicide use and mowing and mechanical.
So I'll try to explain. I'll try to explain the study design, Phil, because it is one of the it's one of the things that make this site so special from a research perspective. One thing that makes it special is the fact that we have 65 years of data. The other thing that makes it special is if you can picture, it's an almost 3-mile length of right-of-way, and this is transmission right-of-way. So these are the big towers that carry electricity over long distances. And the right-of-way itself runs through a forested landscape, an Appalachian forest landscape. And the right-of-way is about 200 feet at least in width. So it's a wide right-of-way. And it's 2 miles. And within that 2 miles, we have replicates of different types of vegetation management strategy. So that's nice. So we were able to replicate these management approaches. And the approaches that have been tested on State Game Lands 33 are hand cutting. So where you just take down the vegetation using chainsaws by hand. Mowing, you can picture what mowing is, larger mowers than people would use obviously in their yards. And then there's different types of integrated vegetation management approaches that use herbicides. One of the approaches is just high volume herbicide application where it's non-selective. So you just spray the area with herbicide when the plants are getting too high and might interfere with the power lines. But then there are other approaches that are very selective. And the two selective herbicide approaches that we are looking at is what's called low volume foliar, where non-compatible plants are sprayed. Their leaves are sprayed, so they're sprayed during the growing season, and they're sprayed and removed. So if you see like a red oak seedling emerging, and you would spray that particular red oak seedling and remove it from the right-of-way. And the other selective approach is called basal low volume, where instead of just spraying the entire plant, the woody plant is kind of cut and then herbicide is applied directly to the stem. And in my opinion, the basal low volume is the most selective application type of habitat management that we perform up on the rights of way.
So relate that now to your biodiversity studies or impacts.
Okay. So I always have to make this very clear to listeners or to researchers that I work with. Each technique can promote different types of wildlife. And I'm going to start with hand cutting first, because hand cutting is actually a really great method for developing brushy, woody habitat. And there are species of wildlife that really like brushy, woody habitat. For example, Appalachian cottontails and red-eyed vireos, which is a type of bird, catbirds, they thrive in that habitat. That habitat, however, is not compatible with rights-of-ways because we just have oak trees that grow up over time and have to be cut. And so it costs a lot of money to maintain it. Okay, so from a biodiversity perspective, if you're managing for those woody vegetation species, it's fine, but it's not compatible with the right-of-way. What we have found, however, is that these selective herbicide approaches, they create, instead of that woody vegetation that regrows, the selective herbicide applications create a field type environment dominated by forbs and low growing shrubs. So instead of the woody trees, oaks coming back, you have a field of goldenrod and asters and rubus, blackberries coming back. And they support a different assemblage of biodiversity, like native bees and grassland breeding birds and snakes that need access to sunlight for basking, and rare species of forb plants like yellow loosestrife and woodland lily. So, as far as biodiversity goes, all of those approaches that I mentioned do support wildlife, but it's what is most compatible with the power lines and also can support a diverse native community. There is one approach that is the least beneficial for biodiversity, and that's the non-selective herbicide application. So when herbicides are applied at high rates non-selectively, they remove all vegetation, whether it be woody or forbs or forbs. And so, of course, it reduces the diversity of the native plants in that case. So to tie it again back to biodiversity, the selective herbicide approaches promote the most biodiversity that is also compatible with rights of way. Yeah, so from a practical perspective, so now like if I was working for the industry, I can make conclusions from my research area, which is a Appalachian forest. So I'm not quite sure how, there'd be other challenges managing in other habitats, especially places like the South where they have a very long growing season, or the West Coast where they have to deal with these fires. But I will talk from our perspective. One of the greatest costs to this type of approach is the initial, when a company initially moves from, let's say they have a mowing regime, and then they move to a selective herbicide regime. Because what they will have to do is reset the habitat. So they may have to go in and they may have to do a selective herbicide spray at first, once, and kind of knock back the vegetation. And then it's very important over the next probably 5 to 7 years that you have trained crews that can go in and can target and remove the non-compatible vegetation. So it's all about identifying non-compatible vegetation, and I keep using oak trees, it's because it's a great example in our part of the world, and letting the compatible vegetation grow. And sometimes the compatible vegetation is woody vegetation. Things like mountain laurel is compatible, Allegheny azalea plants, they're compatible. Witch hazel is compatible. So you need to have some level of expertise. But then what we see after about 7 years is the habitat now starts to stabilize. So you start to have this more stable environment of shrubs and forbs that you don't need to treat as often. And those plants themselves help keep the non-compatible trees from growing through. So the initial cost can be high. And I think that's one of the issues. I would say one of the challenges with this approach is that to start, you have to put in higher investment. But over 60 years, your investment is quite low, because now when the industry comes back to our study sites to treat them, they use very little herbicide because the selective sites have stabilized into this early successional shrub forb habitat that you don't need that much effort to maintain. But the beginning is going to require an investment. Money is related to this in expertise. You need people who can identify the plants properly. So it's an initial investment. My research and others' work has shown that after that initial period of time, the costs decline dramatically because you have achieved that early successional native habitat that can be maintained with much lower costs than yearly or every other year mowing, for example.
So you said 7 years. Is that based on, is that 3 treatments, or is that truly 7 years?
What I would say, Phil, and you know, every site is different, but I'll use our research for an example, just as I noticed plants regrowing. In the beginning, if you went in and you were removing woody vegetation, you may have to go every other year, every 2 years. And every 2 years in the beginning, it might be quite a bit of investment. You might be using quite a bit of herbicide to reset those plots from mowed or hand cut. But then after that 5 to 7 year period, you need to go back every 5 years is really the rotation that they're following up on State Game Lands 33. They just go back every 5 years. And in our selective herbicide sites, they spot treat them. So, right, in the beginning, it's going to be much more intensive because you really have to knock back those non-compatible species that are non-compatible with the power lines. You have to knock them back to permit the compatible vegetation to fill in and to grow, and then help you keep the non-compatible vegetation from growing. So it does become a partnership with some of these plants. I mean, if you have thick shrub cover or very thick forb cover, like a thick cover of goldenrods, for example, those plant communities will help keep the non-compatible plants out of your right-of-way.
You mentioned that yours is in the Appalachian hardwoods, but there's only one green or Game Lands 33. So around, I believe you helped Sonoma State get something started out there in research. But other than that, is the research around the country, and how applicable is your research to those areas?
Well, we just had a conference in October, and it was a plenary session at this conference that I organized. And we had faculty from New York State, New Jersey, Jackson State in the South, and Sonoma State, California, and what we found, and Ohio State. And really that particular seminar, we were focusing on how can you best manage rights of ways for pollinators. And some of the simple things that came out of the seminar was that if you can have high cover of forbs, and forbs are anything that blooms that's not a grass. Okay, and I keep talking about goldenrod, but goldenrod's a great example. Asters are a great example. Things like Queen Anne's lace, which is a naturalized plant, are really good examples of that. If you can increase your cover of forbs, you will increase your native pollinator communities. We see that across all sites. So these other sites where they're doing this type of research are very new. They don't have 60 years of work, but some of their initial conclusions are similar to what we see at State Game Lands 33. Selective integrated vegetation management is best for maintaining and initiating those forb communities that are necessary for high pollinator diversity. And it requires training and commitment. And one of the biggest problems all of us as researchers have is the disconnect between theory and practice. So in theory, on our protected research plots, we know that selective integrated vegetation management, the use of herbicides, for example, to remove non-compatible plants, works. When we go outside of our research plots, we all have stories of people coming in and saying they're doing integrated vegetation management when really all they're doing is moving from a mowing regime to a high herbicide, non-selective spraying regime, which removes all plants. That is not what we are talking about. We're talking about professionals who can identify plant communities applying herbicides very selectively on a several year rotation. So that disconnect between theory and practice, we see at all of our study sites. But the one commonality is that this effort to increase forb cover, flowering plant cover, will increase native pollinators. And it works through targeted, selective, integrated vegetation management. Is a practice in which you can achieve that type of habitat.
So tell us who your sponsors are first.
Okay, I will. I'm very happy to
partners.
talk about the sponsors. So the sponsors of the research are First Energy. And First Energy has a lot of subsidiary companies as part of it, one of which is Pico in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania. We also work with Asplund, which has really been the leader in this project since the 1950s. The Asplund family has been involved in this research in one level or another. And we're also working with Corteva Agrisciences. We use many of their herbicide products when we do the selective herbicide application. I do want the people listening to this to understand that at Penn State University, we measure the response to the management. We do not do the management. So the management is overseen and paid for by these industry research partners. We, the Penn State researchers, measure the response to that. So those are the current partners right now. We're also working, Phil, with the Tree Fund, who they are helping us kind of manage the funding so that the industry funding can get managed into a particular account at the Tree Fund, which is a nonprofit organization, and then they work between Penn State and industry to make sure that the funding happens each year. To be honest, as you move through the work from an ecological side, it's very interesting when I present the findings of our work at academic conferences versus industry conferences. Industry asks the questions, what is this going to cost? Why should we do it? What benefits will it get us? To be honest, academics are a little bit suspicious. They're a little bit suspicious that you're actually saying that herbicides can work. And Corteva's funding you, and maybe Corteva's making you say that herbicides work. So there is that little bit of pushback that I sometimes get from academic circles. But having said all of that, Penn State is very good at setting up agreements whereby, as the researcher, I direct the research and I put into those agreements the freedom to publish and to put our work into peer-reviewed journals. Nothing is hidden, and no one's ever asked me to hide anything. So we're able to present our work. What does that do for industry? Well, for industry, they seem to like glossy brochures and PowerPoint slides. But in reality, for industry to have credibility, the fact that our work is published in very good peer-reviewed journals and has been for 60 years gives them the credibility that they need, because an internal document is not credibility to the public. So that's why I like working with industry. I like working with these particular partners in industry. I've never considered leaving academia because I think the fact that I'm in academia gives my work the weight that it needs to actually help industry. If I worked for industry and I did this research, I don't think it would have the same credibility, even though it might be exactly the same as it does with me being in academia. And I also like bringing students, and I like getting students involved. And every year we've had undergraduates or graduate students involved with the project. And that's something that I truly enjoy, and I don't want to give that up. I have to say, I think some of my work, and not just with students who've worked on the project, but I also work, I incorporate my research into my classroom. So I think I have expanded students' minds, because a lot of students that go into ecology or environmental science, they're dreaming of working for the Nature Conservancy or the Park Service, not Corteva Agrisciences, to be honest. But then when they see the research and they see the fact that that industrial lands make up a big part of our landscape, and the difference that they can make if they're managed properly, I think their mindset changes. So I try to introduce students either through Zoom meetings. I'll have people come in and talk to the students from industry. And I also have alums. Yes, I have mentored students that have graduated from Penn State and now are working for industry, not necessarily in the rights of way area, but I have students now that are working for pharmaceutical companies and helping them increase their sustainability footprint by how they buy plastics for, medicine bottles. I have had a student, he did an internship with First Energy, and now he's working with the energy companies. Not necessarily in a direct environmental way, but indirectly by improving their sustainability footprint. And I've had students go on to work for several companies, including Sheets, which is located here in central Pennsylvania, to focus on how can ecology and environmental graduates work directly with industry to improve environmental impacts from the industrial side. And it's been really rewarding, and those students have made quite a bit of difference in the respective industries in which they work. I
don't know if I told you this, Tej, but Carolyn got her early start on game lands with Dr. Burns.
I
Burns or
worked with
Bramble?
Bramble, yep. So that was one of the first
Okay.
influences on me that made me want to do this project.
One of my first rights away I was ever on was sitting real early in the morning with Dr. Bramble, listening for birds. Right. And he could hear them, and I always shook my head. Did he make that up?
No.
Birders are a unique group.
Yes. And that's aside from vegetation, as far as data sets go, we have the longest data set on vegetation. So vegetation collection goes back to the late 1950s. The second longest is on breeding birds. We have data on breeding birds at State Game Lands 33 that go back to the early 1980s, I think 1981. And so we can look at changes in bird communities through time, species distributions, reproductive success. So we have a really nice data set on birds up on State Game Lands 33.
And most recently, the focus has been on pollinators?
Yes. So
what's next?
Yes. So in 2016, we conducted a project looking at native bees. And I think most people are aware of the recent work that has indicated that pollinators are declining worldwide, and they're declining very rapidly. And we're not quite sure why. Part of it could be due to human used chemicals, in particular insecticides that have been used to control agricultural pests, which are sprayed often, maybe 3 times a month, for example, in certain crops. So insecticides, others changes in habitat. So pollinators have been declining very dramatically. So in 2016, we proposed here at Penn State that we study native pollinators and see, can rights of ways, if managed properly, be good habitat for native pollinators? And indeed, we found them to be excellent habitat for native pollinators. We found 2 new state records of native bees. We found the occurrence of the golden bumblebee, which is recognized as a species that may be extinct in 60 years, but it's doing quite well up on the rights of way on our selective integrated vegetation management plots is where those are found. So rights of way, if managed properly, can be good habitat for pollinators. So my research team presented that work, and we presented and published that work. And while we were presenting the work, we would often get questions from other academics who would ask, well, what's going on in the soil? Maybe herbicides have been accumulating over time and the soil isn't very healthy. Just because you have the flowers and the bees are there, maybe the soil isn't doing well. So we proposed to study ground beetles because they are really important and good, a viable indicator of soil health. And we started researching ground beetles during the pandemic. So 2020 was the first year we did that collection. And right now we are in the process of identifying those species and looking at communities to see if has been an effect on herbicides on ground beetles. And initial data that is coming in indicates there has not been any effect of this integrated vegetation management treatment on the ground beetle community.
Well, going to be interesting to see years come.
Yes, very interesting.
You focus on and where that research goes.
Yeah. And I do want to say, Phil, too, here, the research, obviously this research is funded by industry, and there's particular objectives that industry has, as far as, what management approaches work best, can it be compatible with biodiversity? But I also want to make it clear that industry, through their funding, is supporting pure science. As I said, we are finding really interesting information about distribution records in species of beetles and native bees that we did not know about. We're finding some interesting even results in some of the honeybees we've been collecting. So honeybees are not native to North America, but we still collect them on our study sites, and we're noticing some interesting anatomical differences in honeybees across the state. So even though that's not the objective of this research, some very good, pure science is coming out of our results, and we're really grateful for that on the science side of things.
Very good. You have a great website that people can see summaries.
Yes. I don't know it offhand, but the easiest way to find our website is you just go into Google and you type in transmission ecology, Penn State. Just type that in any search engine, and our site will come up. All of our reports are there. All of our peer-reviewed publications are there. Summaries of the work that we have done in the past is there. So that's kind of the place where we're putting all our information. And very, very recently, Phil, I have been asked to expand our work onto gas and oil rights-of-ways, which are managed differently than transmission lines for electricity. And so we're going to be initiating a project this summer with Shell on a pipeline right-of-way down by Pittsburgh, and they are permitting us to set it up as a replica of State Game Lands 33, where we'll take 2 miles of gas transmission rights-of-way, divide it up into different treatments, and look at wildlife responses to those treatments.
Carolyn, you gave us your website. Are you willing to have people interested in your research or replicating your research reach out to you directly?
Yes. So, Phil, that would be great. On my website is my email address. So it's publicly available. If you just type in Carolyn Mahan, Penn State, you'll find my email address. So yes, people may reach out to me if they have specific questions, and they may have questions about how to get a research project like this started. I also have faculty, research colleagues around the country that are doing similar work. Some of their projects are just getting started, but I can also connect industry with researchers in other parts of the country as well, if people are interested in that. So people should not be shy about reaching out to me directly.
Very good. Carolyn, I want to thank you for your time. Very much appreciate it. Excited to see you again.
Oh, you too, Phil. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of the Trees and Lines podcast, brought to you by Iapetus Infrastructure Services. If you like the show, please give us a rating of 5 stars on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests in the future, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.